The late 1960s was marked by some of the most change the world had ever seen. In America, a blossoming civil rights movement signaled that a change was going to come, whether everyone was ready for it or not. And across the pond, the Vietnam War was still ongoing, still deadly, and still the subject of even more upheaval in America. It might seem trivial then to analyze such a tumultuous time through the lens of the Oscar ceremony of 1968. But in my opinion, there is no better lens to analyze. The 1968 Academy Awards, which honored the films in 1967, was originally set to take place April 8th, but it was postponed 2 days after the country was shattered by news of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Several prominent black figures, including Sidney Poitier and Louis Armstrong, originally declined to appear at the Oscars in protest before finally attending in solidarity, and several of the films nominated for key awards tackled issues of racism, interracial relationships, the senselessness of violence, and ideas of nihilism that would have shocked audiences even a few years prior. This was a time when all bets were off and the Hollywood of old and new faced off, and we're going to look at it all. In order to prepare for this monumental undertaking, I watched 45 of the 47 total films nominated across all categories this year, and read everything from newspapers of the time to the book Pictures at a Revolution, which is a 512-page odyssey covering the 5 Best Picture nominees of the year and how they signaled the change in America. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what we can learn from the 1968 Oscars. ABC broadcast the ceremony across the entire ABC radio network, with this being the final Oscar ceremony that was broadcast via radio. The show was hosted by Bob Hope, and if you watched my last Oscar ceremony deep dive, you'll know my thoughts on him. Hope is a funny guy, but his humor doesn't work for everyone, and although several angry comments on my last video are getting me to reevaluate whether or not I find Hope funny, I still don't think he's quite for me. Most of his jokes poke fun at people, and he's constantly complaining about something.
Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. You all know him, Maharishi, India's answer to Cool Hand Luke. Some of our stars went to India to study transcendental meditation. I went to diction class to learn how to say it. I can't imagine him nominating a kid like Dustin Hoffman. He starred in a picture we can't get in to see. Actually, I don't know what the writers have been smoking this year. Bonnie and Clyde is about happy killers, Dr. Dolittle talking to animals, The Graduate, seduction, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, intermarriage, and in the heat of the night, racism. I want to tell you I've got a great plot for my next movie. It may win an Oscar. I'm going to play a chain gang sheriff who sticks up sex-crazed housewives, then marries a zebra and spends his honeymoon playing tic-tac-toe.
Still, he's at least brief in his remarks, and we get right into the ceremony after only a few minutes. One other thing worth mentioning before our first award, though, is that this ceremony had 18 of the 20 acting nominees present, which was a record at the time and due to an all-out push by Academy President Gregory Peck. The only 2 missing were Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy, and Tracy was unfortunately nominated posthumously. But more on that later. Our first award is Best Achievement in Sound, and right away you're going to see that this ceremony was absolutely stacked. I mentioned that a lot of the films nominated fall under the idea of New Hollywood, and just listing the nominees here should prove it. The first nominee is The Dirty Dozen, a war movie which follows a group of 12 convicts who are forced to attempt an impossible mission and cross enemy lines to assassinate several Germans. Right away, this isn't your parents' military movie. It's gritty, it's hyper-masculine, and it's extremely modern. We'll be talking about The Dirty Dozen a lot. Another nominee is In the Heat of the Night, which stars our main character of the night, Sidney Poitier. I've already mentioned Poitier as one of the key figures who originally opted not to attend the ceremony in honor of Dr. King, and we're going to mention Poitier a lot tonight. In 1964, Poitier became the first black actor to ever win the Best Actor award, and this year he stars in 2 of our 5 Best Picture nominees. The first is In the Heat of the Night, which follows an African-American police detective who is arrested on suspicion of murder by a racist white police chief. Poitier plays the detective Virgil Tibbs, and throughout the night he not only proves his own innocence, but teams up with the white chief to apprehend the real killer. This film tackled race issues head-on. It doesn't take a minor look at the issue or paint a white savior message like some films still do to this day. Poitier's Tibbs is not subservient or overly stoic. When people are racist to him, he gets mad. Still, the film ends with a hands and brotherhood depiction that feels as though it undermines much of the film's message, and it almost seems as though a sharp ending was undercut by the desire to make sequels. And sequels were made. They Call Me Mr. Tibbs came out 3 years later in 1970, and a television series called In the Heat of the Night aired for 8 seasons from 1988 to 1995. However, it would be wrong to suggest that this is not a new Hollywood film, and this and The Dirty Dozen are strikingly unique when compared to the other 3 nominations in sound: Camelot, Dr. Dolittle, and Thoroughly Modern Millie. I'll be discussing all 3 of these films again shortly, because I find 2 of them to be particularly fascinating. But for now, I want to announce the winner, In the Heat of the Night. That's 1 point for New Hollywood. Next up is the Best Supporting Actor Award, and here is where things get interesting. If you watched my video on the 1953 awards, you may remember that we were over halfway through the ceremony before all 5 Best Picture nominees had been up for an award. That is not the case this year. One thing we are about to see is that this year is remarkably top-heavy, with so many repeat nominations that you're going to get tired of me talking about the same films over and over. But these movies are just that good. We've already discussed 2 Best Picture nominees, In the Heat of the Night and The Dirty Dozen wasn't nominated for Best Picture? Surprisingly, the second nomination we've already discussed is Dr. Dolittle, and so I guess we should mention what Dr. Dolittle is. You're probably already familiar with the idea behind the Doctor, as the film has been remade for basically every generation since the late 60s. But if you're not, Dolittle can speak to animals, which is about as hilarious as it sounds, by which I mean kind of funny for 10 minutes maybe. The Dolittle character is based on a series of novels by Hugh Lofting that began in 1920, and attempts to adapt the novels to film began around that same time. However, the idea of talking animals was one that proved difficult to adapt to the visual medium, and it wasn't until 1967 when advances in special effects helped make this idea a reality. Unfortunately, Dolittle bombed. The film cost almost $18 million and made about only half that, and its Best Picture nominee was incredibly surprising. According to Mark Harris, it was due to free prime rib and free booze screenings of the film, and it makes Dolittle one of many instances of using connections to essentially game the ceremony. It's firmly old Hollywood, which is not a bad thing, by the way. I want to get that right out of the way because I'm a huge fan of old Hollywood. It's literally the basis for my channel. I just think that old Hollywood's peak was well before 67, and the goofy, family-friendly, happy-go-lucky old Hollywood films of the late 60s just couldn't compete with the new Hollywood films that tackled such powerful and pertinent issues. Old Hollywood thrived within the studio system, a system that was all but collapsed in 67. Unsurprisingly, Dolittle was not nominated in our second award of the night, Best Supporting Actor. So, who was nominated? We get a nom for John Cassavetes in The Dirty Dozen. Again, this film follows a dozen prisoners, and so it's an ensemble piece more than anything else. Any number of men could have and deserved nominations here, like Charles Bronson, or Jim Brown, or Ernest Borgnine. But Cassavetes is as good a pick as any. He plays the troublemaker of the group, and adds a lot to the idea that these 12 men are not necessarily our heroes. They are convicts. It's the sort of nuance I really appreciate, and he's probably my third favorite performance nominated. My 2 least favorites are from Best Picture nominee number 3, Bonnie and Clyde. In the interest of pacing, I'll return to Bonnie and Clyde in a second, but for now I'll mention that Gene Hackman and Michael J. Pollard are our 2 nominees here. And they're both good, but it's rare that nominating 2 performances from a single film does anything other than just split votes between the 2. My dad's favorite actor of all time is Hackman, but he was just getting started this year. This was Hackman's first ever nomination, and he's been nominated 5 times total with 2 wins for The French Connection and Unforgiven. Again, he's just getting his footing in 1968, and I'll save Hackman praise for when he really took off in the 70s. My second favorite nomination is Cecil Kellaway for his performance in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Best Picture nominee number 4. But to be honest, the Academy got it right this year, according to me. The winner is George Kennedy for his fantastic role in Cool Hand Luke. Cool Hand Luke is another film we're going to mention a lot tonight, as it's probably one of my 4 or 5 favorite films of the night. Similarly to The Dirty Dozen, it's another hyper-masculine movie, which follows Paul Newman as Luke, a rebel who is in prison for taking the heads off of parking meters. He is sentenced to work for a chain gang, and Luke takes every opportunity possible to escape. It's very much New Hollywood, anti-authority and anti-establishment. And while Paul Newman is the star of the show, George Kennedy is a brilliant foil to him, playing Dragline, one of Luke's fellow prisoners who absolutely despises Luke's laid-back attitude. I wasn't super familiar with George Kennedy before this year, but he's also in The Dirty Dozen, giving an equally impressive performance there, and I'm super happy he won the Oscar tonight. Cool Hand Luke was not nominated for Best Picture though, and while we've mentioned 4 of the 5 nominees so far, we haven't yet discussed my favorite.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
The Graduate. For research for this video, I watched most movies only a single time, and for many, it was my first time, not for The Graduate. I had already seen it at least 2 or 3 times, and I've kept it on repeat for the last month. I just graduated college a few weeks ago, and I relate more than ever to Benjamin's search for what comes next. Not to mention the stellar performances by the entire principal cast, and the legendary soundtrack by Simon and Garfunkel. While I love a lot of films nominated, The Graduate deserves its spot as a Best Picture nominee. It's my favorite film of the night. Let's quickly look at our 5 nominees in the major category. 1 box office flop stuck in a bygone time. 1 detective thriller that tackles race issues but doesn't quite go all the way. 1 film about the existential crisis of graduating college and how scary that can be. And Bonnie and Clyde and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Bonnie and Clyde is probably the poster child of 1967. It is the film discussed most prominently in Mark Harris's book on the year, and it's probably the film most people would consider their favorite. And it's easy to see why. If we want to talk revolutionary, let's talk about Bonnie and Clyde. Bonnie and Clyde is another famous story you're probably familiar with, even if you've never seen it. Bonnie and Clyde were bank-robbing lovers, and the laissez-faire attitude towards violence by the film was unheard of. Film school rejects said it best. The film treated the Great Depression with a sense of levity, introduced audiences to the shocking impact of the blood squib, and oscillated on a dime from slapstick humor to violent tragedy. There had never been anything like it. And then there's Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. This is our other Best Picture nominee, starring Sidney Poitier, and it tackles issues relating to interracial marriage and the stigma associated with it in the late 1960s. As mentioned earlier, this was Tracy's final role, and it is one of his most biting and impressive ever. I didn't expect to like this, but I really, really did. Like In the Heat of the Night, it feels almost as though it's old Hollywood masquerading as new Hollywood. Despite the film's touchy subject matter, it makes sure to paint a very interesting picture. Poitier's been married before, but his wife and firstborn child were killed in a car accident. He's also a very well-established doctor, and too squeaky clean to be believable. He is the perfect man, and his unrealistic lack of flaws take the backseat to the film's true protagonists, Hepburn and Tracy, are heroes of an older generation who are kind enough to tolerate their daughter's African-American love. It's the sort of film that Mr. Tibbs would probably hate, and that's one thing I find so fascinating about this Best Picture race. While normally our 5 Best Picture nominees can paint a nuanced picture of a year, the nominees this year almost seem to be pushing and pulling against one another. In Pictures at a Revolution, Harris writes, "Half of the nominees seem to be sneering at the other half. The Father Knows Best values of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner were wittily trashed by The Graduate. The hands joined in brotherhood hopes expressed by In the Heat of the Night had little in common with the middle finger of insurrection extended by Bonnie and Clyde." Knowing this, it seems even more true now that the Best Picture nominee would be one of the films towing the line between old and new Hollywood. The Graduate and Bonnie and Clyde are too modern. Dr. Dolittle is too ancient. But between In the Heat of the Night and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which would earn the top prize? We'll get back to it. With all of these films, there is still much more to discuss. Best Cinematography is the next award of the night, presented by none other than The Graduate stars Catherine Ross and Dustin Hoffman. Both exploded in popularity with younger generations, and they almost seem uncomfortable riffing with the much older Bob Hope. Hope pokes fun at both Ross and Hoffman, and instead of poking fun back like older stars may have done, Hoffman almost seems to avoid confrontation out of fear. It's a fascinating interaction.
Welcome, kids. The nominees are listed here, and the idiot cards are out there.
I don't think we need them.
You don't need those? You mean you've memorized what you've got to say?
Yes.
Well, if you can't read, that's the way, I guess.
Cinematography is also notable as it is a single award this year. In my last ceremony deep dive, there were several categories that were split up into two sections, those for black and white films and those for color. Cinematography was one of those categories, and the nominees are for 4 color films and 1 in black and white. There are nominations for Bonnie and Clyde, Dr. Dolittle, and The Graduate. In my opinion, all 3 had exceptional cinematography. In particular, the framing in Bonnie and Clyde was masterful in its way of showing so much violence while avoiding showing anything graphic at all. Bonnie and Clyde will ultimately win the Oscar. The new nominee is In Cold Blood, which doesn't win here but probably should have. In Cold Blood was a Truman Capote film about 2 convicts who enter a wealthy family's home in hopes of robbing them. However, when they find their safe of valuables completely empty, they become enraged and murder the family, spending the rest of the film on the run. If you're sensing a theme of films that push the boundaries, then I applaud you. This is another anti-authority film, and in my opinion, its dark and depressing black and white cinematography makes it certainly worth watching. And then there's a repeat nomination for Camelot, and it's about time I mentioned this fascinating musical. While Camelot was not a very successful film of 1967, it is certainly a response to the most successful film of the decade. The Sound of Music, a sensation to end all sensations, and just one of the broad range of high-budget studio musicals that dominated the era. Mary Poppins was another huge hit, and while it didn't gross the $158 million that The Sound of Music did, there were huge hits in Oliver, The Music Man, and West Side Story. Camelot, however, was a big flop, and it's super fascinating in the context of the battle between Hollywood of old and new. You'll see later on, Camelot is not the only high-budget musical nominated for awards tonight, but it is the most prominent. It's firmly old Hollywood, great fun for the entire family, and existing entirely separate from the social issues and other prominent films of the night. The production history for Camelot was deeply troubled. For the role of King Arthur, everyone was considered from Rock Hudson to Richard Burton, Peter O'Toole, Gregory Peck, and even Marlon Brando. Richard Harris was reluctantly given the role after he literally begged for it, offering to pay for his own screen test in order to show he was serious about wanting it. And for our leading lady, Guinevere, Julie Andrews was the top choice, but she declined, and Audrey Hepburn, Julie Christie, Polly Bergen, Anne Margaret, and Mitzi Gaynor were just some of the women considered alongside Andrews. Again, reluctantly, due to her left-wing activism, Vanessa Redgrave was finally offered the role due to the fact that she was at least a good singer, something that could not be said for Richard Harris. When the film finally did release, it did so to poor reviews and less than stellar returns on investment. Richard L. Coe of the Washington Post wrote that Camelot was long, leaden, and lugubrious. The Warner's Camelot is $15 million worth of wooden nickels. Besides being a hopelessly, needlessly lavish, this misses the point squarely on the nail. What was so hot about King Arthur? We're never really told. He adds that Richard Harris as Arthur gave the worst major performance in years. So Camelot fell victim to the same issues that plague superhero films today. Studios see massive success for films within a certain genre and misunderstand the reason for that film's success, assuming the mere genre itself is all people care about, and pouring far too much money and time into a film that ultimately cannot stand aside the successful ones in the first place. One reason I think these older ceremonies are so valuable is that history is a circle destined to repeat itself, and the major films and failures of the year are not too different from the major films of today. But while we've spent a lot of time on films you're probably familiar with, I want to give some respect to films you may not be aware of, and it's time we give some love to the 11 short films nominated across 3 categories tonight. Best Live Action Short, Best Documentary Short, and Best Animated Short. 11 films ranging from 7 minutes to 30, and from the astonishingly good to the irredeemably bad. All 3 nominations in the animated short category were really fun and enjoyable. All can be found on YouTube too, and I'll link them in the description below. There's What on Earth, a pretty fun faux documentary about how Martians may misinterpret humans as cars simply because of how often we spend our days inside of them. There's Hypothesis Beta, about a punch card hole that doesn't want to stay still. It's an absolutely absurd concept, but it works surprisingly well and doesn't overstay its welcome. And then there's our winning short, The Box, directed by Fred Wolf of the Tootsie Pop commercial fame. It follows a traveler who brings a mysterious box into a bar, and all of the bar patrons' reactions to the horrifying contents inside. The only twist? We don't know what's in the box. I had actually seen the box before, and I really enjoyed revisiting it for the purposes of this video. I had also seen Sky Over Holland, which was nominated for Best Live Action Short. It was a fine travelogue film, but its competition was much better. There was Paddle to the Sea and Stop, Look, and Listen, both really funny and underrated. Paddle to the Sea follows a toy Native American canoe as it makes its way towards the ocean, and Stop, Look, and Listen is a stop-motion short concerning a street race and the dangers it presents. To be honest, my least favorite short was probably A Place to Stand, which ended up winning the award. It's a Canadian documentary showcasing the people of Canada. It's fine, but it just wasn't anything memorable, and Canada just doesn't feel like the exotic locale that the documentary presents it as. A Place to Stand was actually nominated for the documentary short, too, alongside Monument to the Dream, The Redwoods, See You at the Pillar, and While I Run This Race. Again, I find A Place to Stand to be the weakest here. See You at the Pillar is another travel documentary, this time covering Dublin, which is at least a little different, but both are dry. Monument to the Dream and While I Run This Race are also fairly cut and dry, covering the St. Louis Arch and poverty, respectively. I like these documentary shorts just because they work well as time capsules, but I'm glad that I think the Academy got it right giving the award to The Redwoods, which was made as a way to preserve the redwood forest and argue for its preservation, and it is just absolutely stunning. It deserved a cinematography nod, to be completely honest, and at only 20 minutes, I'd recommend you check it out. I'll link it below. The documentary shorts, though, are at least all short. The same can't be said for the feature-length contenders, The Anderson Platoon, which won the award, Festival, Harvest, A King's Story, and A Time for Burning. I wasn't able to watch A King's Story as I couldn't find it anywhere, but none of the other contenders really amazed me anyway. I mean, the main thing worth mentioning is that the documentaries obviously helped me a lot in contextualizing the big events of the year. We have every hot-button issue tackled from the Vietnam War to integration in a white church. Overall, though, societal issues may have been better touched upon in our fictional films. At this point in the ceremony, it was time to give out the first honorary award of the night. Honorary awards were a big deal in early Academy Award ceremonies, and they were a way to pay tribute and honor huge figures in Hollywood that may not be up for an award that given year. Tonight, 3 men received awards, starting with Arthur Freed, a huge musicals producer who worked on films like Singing in the Rain and An American in Paris. There was also an honorary award given to Academy President Gregory Peck and Alfred Hitchcock. Hitchcock's award is particularly notable, though, as he holds the record for one of the shortest acceptance speeches of all time.
Thank you.
Speaking of things that are notable about this ceremony, let's talk about the next award, Best Costume Design. Eva Marie Saint presents the award to Camelot, which beats out The Happiest Millionaire, another 3-hour musical by Disney attempting to replicate the success of the genre. Also, Thoroughly Modern Millie, which I said I would mention later and which I'll mention now. It's another musical. The only non-musicals nominated were Shakespeare adaptation The Taming of the Shrew and Bonnie and Clyde, but none of this is as interesting to me as the lack of a nomination for Edith Head. If there is one costume designer more famous in Hollywood than any other, it is Edith Head, a costume designing juggernaut, an inspiration for Edna Mode from The Incredibles. Head is the woman who has won more Academy Awards than anyone in history, with 8 to her name, but she wasn't even nominated in 1968, which was the first time she hadn't been up for an Oscar since 1949. She was literally nominated for 19 years in a row. Head made her mark on 6 films in 1967, but unfortunately the Academy didn't find her work worthy of a nod. Some categories were really competitive though, and so it makes sense. Costume design was an extremely established award in the Academy's history, unlike our following 2 awards, visual effects and sound effects. Both had only 2 nominees, Dr. Dolittle and Tobruk for visuals, and The Dirty Dozen and In the Heat of the Night for sound. Tobruk was a World War II film that was really dreadful and one of my least favorite films of the night, and so I'm happy the award went to the Doctor. And The Dirty Dozen deservedly takes home sound effects too. And I'll quickly cover 2 more awards, Best Film Editing and Best Foreign Film. As I've mentioned in previous videos, if you want to know what's going to win Best Picture, take a look at what wins Best Editing. 2 in every 3 Best Editing winners are also the Best Picture winner, and 3 of our 5 nominees tonight are up for the top award. There's The Forgettable Beach Red, The Dirty Dozen, and Best Picture nominees Dr. Dolittle, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and In the Heat of the Night. If you notice, these are also the three that are more classically aligned, and I've already mentioned that the latter two are the perfect Best Picture nominee. Modern, but not thoroughly modern. And unsurprisingly, our winner is In the Heat of the Night, giving that film a pretty large edge on our path towards the Oscar. But it isn't over yet. There's a fairly new award tonight, too. Best Foreign Language Film did not exist until 1956, and tonight it is between 5 films. Unfortunately, I was unable to find Japan's Portrait of Chieco, and my viewings of Bewitched Love from Spain and Romania's I Even Met Happy Gypsies were far from ideal. But in my opinion, this award wasn't too competitive this year. Live for Life from France won the Golden Globe, and was the frontrunner for the Oscar. But there was an upset when Czechoslovakia's Closely Watched Trains won the award, the second and final time to date that Czechoslovakia took home the prize. Closely Watched Trains was really good. It follows Milos, a young train operator who works in Nazi-occupied territory in World War II. I typically don't care for really dense historical stories like these, but Closely Watched Trains was really touching. And while the thesis of this video is primarily focused on changes in Hollywood and America of 1968, there was so much going on in other parts of the world that are worth discussing too. The Czech New Wave is full of visionary filmmakers operating at the peak of their abilities, and I would be remiss to not give Closely Watched Trains the credit it deserves. Speaking of deserving, we're getting to the end of the ceremony now, and what follows is one of the more interesting awards of the night. Best Supporting Actress, presented by previous actor winner Walter Matthau. 5 talented women were nominated, but the award was really set from the get-go. Estelle Parsons was going to win for Bonnie and Clyde. And I don't want to slander Bonnie and Clyde, as it seems as though I am, but I was really excited to see the other nominees. Carol Channing was okay in Thoroughly Modern Millie, and Mildred Natwick was forgettable in Barefoot in the Park. But Catherine Ross was surprisingly nominated for The Graduate, for her role as Elaine Robinson, Mrs. Robinson's daughter, and maybe the most nuanced role of the entire film. I thought Ross played Elaine really delicately, and her naivete and sweetness plays really well against Dustin Hoffman's more selfish Benjamin. The last shot of The Graduate alone cemented for me that Ross deserved the win, but unfortunately it did not go her way. And most surprisingly, Bea Richards was nominated for Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Richards plays Sidney Poitier's mother in the film, and she is only on screen for about 9% of the time. Still, she makes her mark as a woman who is worried about her son's interracial love, but is willing to give it a chance for his happiness. Mark Harris explains in Pictures at a Revolution that Richards had received no major film offers since making the movie, and had gone back to working in theater, hoping to find steadier employment. And in a sweet story, the film's director Stanley Kramer called Richards after the nominations were announced, telling her that of every nomination for Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, including one for his direction, he could not be happier about any nomination than Richards. And while she ultimately loses the award, I was happy she was nominated. There are 4 below-the-line awards to go before we reach the headlining awards, and they really start to paint a picture that this is a top-heavy award ceremony. While oftentimes there may be 10 or more major films, this ceremony has only a few. Art direction goes to Camelot, as period pieces often do win the award. But it is up against tough competition with films like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner or Thoroughly Modern Millie. I feel like I haven't given Millie enough attention yet, which is mostly due to the fact that I just didn't like it, but it's about to win the next award for original score, which it does deserve. Millie is a musical about a showwoman played by Julie Andrews, trying to find work in the flapper industry of the 1920s. It's a look backwards 4 decades, in the same way we are currently in a boom of 1980s content. And Julie Andrews is the leading role. And Julie Andrews in the leading role is a signifier of just how hot of a star she was at the time. It's the quintessential late 60s musical that shows a pretty tired genre that is banking off of nostalgia and star power. In other words, not too dissimilar from films today. And while I knew he wouldn't win it, I was hoping that one of the music Oscars would go to a young 35-year-old composer that you may be familiar with, John Williams. Williams was nominated for his first ever Oscar tonight for his work on Valley of the Dolls, a sexploitation movie that was extremely risque for the time period, and which was based on a novel that had to be severely toned down in themes in order to be released at all. Williams' score for Valley of the Dolls is far from his most iconic work, but given that he has just received his 53rd Oscars nomination, I think it's safe to say he's not too upset about his 1968 loss. Williams is second in nominations behind only Walt Disney with 59. He's still composing music at 91 years old, and he's the only human in history to be nominated for Academy Awards in 7 consecutive decades. He's untouchable, and while he's just getting started, the following award is touchingly for the final film of the only person who's been up for more awards than John, Walt Disney. Best Song is an award that is often derivatively assumed to go to the most popular song of the year, and not necessarily the best one. This year, that was not the case, as Dr. Dolittle's Talk to the Animals won the award against songs from Thoroughly Modern Millie, Banning, James Bond spoof film Casino Royale, and Walt Disney's final film, The Jungle Book. The Bare Necessities is certainly the nominated song that has stood the test of time the longest, but it loses tonight against the only film here that was also up for Best Picture. It's a shame, as Baloo's iconic ballad is one of my all-time favorites. It's also the only nomination The Jungle Book would receive, and it means that while Williams began with a whimper, Disney would leave with one. But, on a lighter note, it's time we covered the above-the-line awards: directing, acting, writing, and picture. And of course, it's a coronation for some legendary films. Best Director surprisingly goes to the young sophomore effort from Mike Nichols, The Graduate. Nichols was up against Arthur Penn for Bonnie and Clyde, Stanley Kramer for Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Norman Jewison for In the Heat of the Night, and Richard Brooks for In Cold Blood. Poor Richard Fleischer. Like what we have today, there are 2 writing awards for an original screenplay and an adapted one, and we're really just seeing a runaway for our top 2 contenders. In the Heat of the Night wins for adapted screenplay, and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner wins for the original one. And for Best Actor, Rod Steiger wins for In the Heat of the Night, and Katharine Hepburn wins for Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. This isn't to say that these are the 2 best scripts of the night, or the 2 best performances. I don't think they are. It's astonishing that Rod Steiger was nominated for In the Heat of the Night over, Sidney Poitier. Poitier is not nominated for either of his 2 monumental achievements, which feels like a slap in the face to 2 of cinema's most iconic roles. And while I don't think his performances were necessarily award-winning, they were certainly worth a nomination. Rod Steiger gives a good performance as the police chief of In the Heat of the Night, but I actually find his performance to be the weakest of those nominated. Warren Beatty as Clyde, Dustin Hoffman as Benjamin, and Paul Newman as Luke all deserve the Oscar more. And if none of the young up-and-comers got it, Spencer Tracy deserved it for his posthumous nomination for Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. On the actor side, Beatty and Hoffman's co-stars Faye Dunaway and Anne Bancroft both got nominations, and both gave great performances, but my top 2 choices are for 2 films I've yet to mention. There's Dame Edith Evans for The Whisperers, a film about an old and lonely woman who begins to experience dementia. It's the same type of role that Anthony Hopkins won for in The Father, and while she doesn't quite reach the heights Hopkins was able to achieve, I find Evans' work to be equal parts moving and tragic. And my favorite actress of the night is Audrey Hepburn for her work in Wait Until Dark, which is probably in my top 100 films of all time. Wait Until Dark is about a blind woman who must fight off home invaders. It's basically Home Alone before Home Alone, but it's an action film starring Audrey Hepburn, and those are few and far between. It's actually really, really good, and I saw it as a kid and fell in love with it then.
The winner is Katharine Hepburn, and guess who's coming to dinner?
It's nice that Audrey Hepburn's namesake, Katharine Hepburn, won the award. She truly deserved it for Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and this was her 10th nomination and 2nd win. She would go on to win 4 Best Actress awards, which is still the record for a performer in any gender. But that leaves us now with just one final award of the night, presented by Julie Andrews. Of course, I'm referring to Best Picture. And although I've spent so much time discussing all 5 of these films, I feel like one of the big takeaways is that Bonnie and Clyde really didn't stand a chance at the award. Bonnie and Clyde is probably the film that has most stood the test of time, and it's the one I personally give the most credit to when discussing the transition of Hollywood old to Hollywood new. The Graduate would be right behind it with its themes of nihilism and its ending, which is one of the greatest to a film of all time. But as we study Ceremonies together, we will find that Hollywood takes baby steps, and just because a film is revolutionary doesn't mean it will be fully embraced by the Academy. Sidney Poitier's duology of noble black men films were more in line with views at the time. We were in the midst of a civil rights movement, and while liberal film fans appreciated Poitier, conservative film fans appreciated this duology too. Instead of Poitier, Rod Steiger and Spencer Tracy are arguably the leads of these two films. Two older white men who are apprehensive of, but ultimately accept a young black man. And it's the type of backpatting that we still see today with films like fellow Best Picture winners Driving Miss Daisy or Green Book. The award will ultimately go to In the Heat of the Night, the slightly less safe pick and a promising sign that Hollywood was about to undergo a huge shift in the types of films that audiences go for. And it's why the 1968 ceremony is often looked at as the calm before the storm. Bonnie and Clyde was insane, but a film like that would never win Best Picture, right? Right?
I don't hear words they're saying, only the echoes of my mind.